Have you ever wondered why, even after so much prayer, it feels like God is silent? Have you ever had the sensation that your prayer hits the ceiling and falls right back down? Perhaps the problem isn't God's absence, but the overwhelming noise around you. What few people will tell you is that God's voice doesn't shout, it whispers, especially in the places where His Word dwells. And among the many texts in the Bible, there are 3 psalms that function like true spiritual transmitters: Psalm 91, Psalm 23, and Psalm 35. They are not just popular. They are living codes of spiritual hearing, faith activation, and divine discernment. Most people seek to hear God's voice through grand signs, yet they ignore that He has already spoken in detail where it matters most, in the Word. When you dive into Psalm 91, you realize how God protects even when everything seems to be collapsing. Meditating on Psalm 23, you learn that His silence is not absence, but care. And praying Psalm 35, you see that even injustice has a response in God's time. In this video, you won't just understand these texts, you'll learn how to use them to identify God's signals in your daily life, win spiritual battles, and transform prayer into practical guidance. Today, you're going to discover what many overlook. Hearing God's voice doesn't depend on technique, but on sensitivity to His Word. Together, we'll study, meditate, and apply each of these psalms, learning how they act as a compass in times of fear, doubt, pain, and waiting. Get your notebook, pen, and heart ready, because what you're about to receive is not just religious theory, but a deep spiritual experience. And in the end, you might realize that God was never silent. He was simply waiting for you to learn how to listen with your soul. Psalm 91 was born in a time of insecurity when the people faced visible and invisible dangers. It is not just a beautiful poem, but a direct response to the crises the human soul confronts daily. It's as if God extends a shelter in the midst of the storm, inviting His children to hide under His wings. Anyone who reads these words feels that God is speaking to them in a deeply personal and intimate way. Each line reveals divine protection, care, and a promise of constant presence that transcends understanding. When the psalmist says, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High," he shows that this kind of safety is not automatic. It's the result of a daily choice. You must dwell, remain, and live in God's presence, not just visit it in moments of emergency. This shifts how we see faith, not as a panic button, but as a lifestyle. The Bible reveals that a genuine relationship with God becomes a shield against the fears that haunt us. He offers real refuge to those who choose to trust wholeheartedly, even when the world around them is falling apart. This psalm also confronts us with the reality of spiritual warfare, mentioning attacks like pestilence, arrows, and the fowler's snare. It acknowledges evil but never glorifies it. Instead, it magnifies the fact that God is greater than any threat. Declaring these promises in faith strengthens the heart and brings peace to the mind. It's as if the powerful prayer of Psalm 91 creates an invisible wall of protection around the life of the righteous. This doesn't cancel the battles, but it ensures we're never alone in them, even when the fight feels overwhelming. The promises are bold and clear. 1,000 may fall at your side. No harm will overtake you. He will deliver you. These aren't just words of encouragement. They're spiritual commitments made by God to those who trust Him. Psalm 91 teaches us how to hear God's voice through His promises, trusting that He is at work, even when nothing changes outwardly. And it's in those very moments when fear tries to take over that faith rises. The miracles of God often happen when we dare to believe before we see anything change. Finally, Psalm 91 ends with God Himself speaking. "Because He has set His love upon me, therefore I will deliver him." This is a divine response to the heart that chooses to stay firm in love. The promise is deliverance, honor, and salvation, and it extends into eternity. It reminds us that God's timing may feel delayed, but it always arrives with precision. And if this promise is already so powerful in context, imagine how much more it reveals when we dig deeper into its structure and allow it to guide our prayers. Psalm 91 has a carefully crafted structure that leads the reader from an initial declaration of faith to the final promise of divine protection. It begins with a bold confession, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High." And this single sentence sets the tone for everything that follows. It's not merely an introduction, but an invitation to intimacy, to a daily and consistent walk in God's presence. This is not about occasional visits in moments of crisis. It's about making God your permanent dwelling place. The Bible shows that everything changes when faith is a state of being, not a reaction to emergency. The second section presents powerful, vivid images of God as our shield, fortress, covering wings, and welcoming refuge. These metaphors speak directly to the soul, providing not just comfort, but supernatural defense. Spiritual warfare is depicted as a tangible threat, but always countered by God's sovereign protection. When faith leans on these images, the mind finds rest, and the spirit is renewed with strength. This portion of the psalm becomes a spiritual armor for the heart, equipping it to face fear, doubt, and adversity with divine confidence. Next, the psalm expands on the scope of God's protection, guarding us against plagues, ambushes, visible dangers, and hidden evils. The message is clear. No matter the source of the threat, God's response will always be stronger and more decisive. This is more than poetic assurance. It is a spiritual covering that reaches every corner of life. The powerful prayer that flows from this truth becomes a shield for the mind and soul. Even the smallest whisper from God is present in the details we often overlook, and his voice speaks comfort even in silence. The psalm then paints a picture of battle already won. 1,000 may fall at your side. This is God showing us that even when everything around us collapses, his hand still holds firm those who trust him. The faith presented here is not passive. It demands action, positioning, and boldness, even when appearances contradict the promises. This structure elevates the believer from inner security to outward confidence. God's perfect timing begins to manifest when the foundation of our faith is solid and built on the unshakable truth of his word. Finally, the last section shifts the tone. Now it is God himself speaking directly. He promises deliverance, answers in times of distress, honor, and eternal salvation for those who love him. This divine voice changes the narrative. It is no longer the psalmist speaking about God, but God declaring his will. It reminds us that in our faith journey, it's not us who end the prayer. It's God who closes with a promise. And if this structure already gives us such deep revelation, just imagine what we unlock when we begin to live it personally, word by word. Psalm 23 is one of the most well-known passages in the Bible, but its true power lies in being more than a memorized verse. It is a declaration of total dependence on God. When the psalmist says, "The Lord is my shepherd," he positions himself as a sheep, fragile, guided, yet fully protected. This changes how we perceive divine care. It's not about religion, it's about relationship. Jesus is not a distant authority figure, but a present and personal shepherd. He knows each name, every wound, and leads with compassion, not force. The first images in the psalm take us to places of rest, green pastures and still waters. This shows us that God not only leads us, but also teaches us to pause, breathe, and be restored. The powerful prayer here is not one of urgent cries, but of surrender, of letting go and allowing him to care for us, even when our minds want to control everything. Hearing God's voice in this passage is about accepting that silence can also be love. Faith in this context is not about striving, it is about resting in His presence. Perhaps the most impactful moment in the psalm is the valley of the shadow of death. The psalmist acknowledges darkness but refuses to fear it because he knows God is walking right beside him. The rod and the staff symbolize both discipline and direction, tools for correction and guidance in the chaos. This verse speaks directly to those facing grief, illness, or emotional collapse. The Bible doesn't ignore pain, it walks through it with the light of God. And this, more than anything, is a sign of mature faith, trust that survives the valley. Then comes the scene where God prepares a table in the presence of enemies, anoints the head with oil, and makes the cup overflow. These are not mere metaphors, they are prophetic acts of honor and restoration. Even those who were attacked, shamed, or forgotten will be lifted up in God's perfect timing. Spiritual battles are not always won by noise, but by silent loyalty. This part of the psalm reminds us that the miracles of God are often public answers to private suffering, a divine response to our quiet endurance. The psalm ends with a promise of companionship. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. This means that when you walk with the shepherd, you don't chase after blessings. Blessings chase after you. This message from God today is a call to lasting confidence. It's the assurance that no matter where you are, He is with you. And if this shepherd cares for us so faithfully day by day, imagine what happens when we turn every verse of this psalm into a living, breathing prayer. To pray Psalm 23 is far more than reciting words. It is about living each line as a present and practical truth. When you say, "The Lord is my shepherd," you are declaring that you no longer need to walk alone or be in control of everything. This personalized prayer transforms your relationship with God into something intimate and secure. Each verse becomes a reminder that Jesus is caring for even the things you cannot see. To pray with faith is to make space for God's voice to gently lead you with peace. A transformative practice is to adapt the psalm to your real-life context. For example, "I shall not want" can become, "Lord, I trust that today I will lack neither peace, nor direction, nor a provision." This kind of direct application renews the mind, aligns the heart, and strengthens your faith, especially on hard days. The Bible stops being a distant text and becomes personal, alive, and effective. Powerful prayer flows more naturally when it is prayed with intention and not just repetition. Meditating on the images of the psalm is also a deep spiritual exercise. Close your eyes and picture green pastures as seasons of rest and still waters as moments of reconnection with God. This visualization helps to fight anxiety and mental fatigue, bringing your soul back to the rhythm of heaven. God's timing is not rushed, it is perfect. Visual prayer also opens the way to hear God's voice without the noise of the world. It calms the heart and allows the Spirit to minister to your inner being. This practice can also be extended to your family, small groups, or as intercession for others. Each person can choose a section of the psalm and declare it in prayer over an area of life: children, health, finances, decisions. This shared prayer builds unity and activates spiritual sensitivity in everyone involved. God is not just speaking to me, He is speaking through me to others. Psalm 23 becomes a bridge between personal and collective faith, deepening spiritual connection in community. Lastly, the psalm teaches us that we don't need to chase after what God has already promised. When you pray with this text, you begin to notice that goodness and mercy are following you. It's like a current of grace that flows toward those who walk with the shepherd. This daily prayer gives clarity and peace of mind, and if praying Psalm 23 brings such rest, imagine what happens when a soul rises up to cry for justice through the boldness of Psalm 35. Psalm 35 is David's heartfelt cry in the face of injustice, but it also serves as a manual for those who suffer in silence. He does not pretend to be strong or hide his pain. He cries out boldly, "Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me." This powerful prayer is a cry for justice, yet it is surrendered to heaven, not driven by personal revenge. The Bible reveals that God is the defender of those wounded without cause. When human words fail, the prayer of the righteous rises like an arrow that hits the mark in the courts of heaven. David describes in detail the persecution, traps, and false accusations launched against him. Still, he chooses not to retaliate, but to seek divine intervention. This teaches us how to strengthen our faith even when the soul is deeply wounded. In times of spiritual warfare, trusting God's justice is the choice of someone who understands that God sees it all. Even when everyone is silent, God is still speaking. He's attentive to the brokenhearted and actively involved in our battles, even the invisible ones. The psalm also reveals David's emotional depth. "How long, Lord?" A raw and honest question, full of pain. This kind of prayer isn't irreverent, it's intimate. He opens his heart like a child who knows he will be received, even in weakness. It teaches us that faith is not the absence of anguish, but the courage to bring that anguish to God. Prayer doesn't have to be beautiful to be effective. It just has to be real. And God honors the prayer that comes from a heart that refuses to fake its wounds. One striking moment is when David, still without an answer, decides to praise, "I will give you thanks in the great assembly." This reveals a faith that anticipates victory even when defeat still surrounds him. The Bible shows us that praise in the midst of pain is one of the most powerful spiritual weapons. God's miracles often begin in this kind of trust, one that worships in advance. Worship becomes a declaration of war against despair, a bold proclamation that God is still in control. This psalm is for those who have been wronged, rejected, or forgotten, and yet chose not to retaliate. It teaches us that resting in God is more powerful than revenge. God's message today is crystal clear. He sees, he acts, and he defends. David's prayer isn't merely a request for justice, it's a statement of mature faith. And if it's already powerful to cry out like this, just imagine what happens when a wounded soul dares to worship before the answer arrives. David surprises us in Psalm 35 by choosing to praise God even before the battle is over. He's still being pursued, still misunderstood, yet he boldly declares, "I will give you thanks in the great assembly." This kind of praise doesn't wait for the miracle. It becomes the miracle, clothed in faith. The Bible reveals that worship in the valley is just as powerful as celebration on the mountaintop. When God is speaking, it's often in that silent space filled with glory that victory begins to take shape. This early praise is a prophetic act, a spiritual answer to the war trying to crush his hope. Instead of complaining, David chooses to worship, even while his enemies still circle. This act breaks invisible chains and weakens the power of accusation. The powerful prayer here comes in the form of a song, maybe quiet, maybe tearful, but undeniably full of trust. This posture doesn't just change the circumstances around the worshiper, it transforms their inner world from fear to boldness. To praise in the middle of pain is to declare, "God, I trust you even when I understand nothing." It's faith without visible proof, hope planted in dry soil. This type of adoration disarms spiritual enemies and magnifies the God who works in silence. The Bible shows that those who worship with broken hearts receive healing in the form of God's presence. The miracles of God often begin on the altar of surrendered praise, long before the breakthrough arrives in the physical world. This principle can be lived out practically. Choose a worship song that declares God's faithfulness and sing it, even when you don't feel like it. It may seem small, but there is great spiritual power in each word sung with faith. Broken hearts become vessels of glory when they refuse to stop praising. Spiritual warfare weakens when the soul begins to sing amid chaos. God's timing is revealed in environments saturated with worship and faith-filled surrender. David ends the psalm by exalting God's righteousness and declaring that the Lord delights in blessing his people. This shows that victory is often closer than we think. It begins in the heart that chooses trust before results. Today, God is saying, those who worship in advance receive more than they expected. And now that we understand the power of each individual psalm, it's time to learn how to pray with all three together, in a practical, powerful, and transformational way. Topic 7. Practical exercise with the three Psalms. Applying Psalms 91, 23, and 35 to your routine is more than reading verses. It's about turning them into compasses for every area of life. Psalm 91 can be your morning prayer before leaving home, serving as a shield of spiritual protection. Psalm 23 fits perfectly at midday, reminding you that God is guiding you with peace and provision. And Psalm 35 becomes your cry at night for justice, release, and rest. 3 moments, 3 psalms, 1 divine direction guiding your every step. Writing down the most meaningful verses from each psalm in a prayer journal is a simple yet effective spiritual discipline. Next to each one, add a personal application. Today, I believe the Lord is my shepherd in my workplace. This personalization turns a powerful prayer into something tangible and relevant. The Bible no longer feels distant. It becomes a daily conversation with God. His voice becomes clearer when you respond with living faith rather than routine repetition. Another practical idea is to create a weekly devotional rhythm. Monday with Psalm 91, Wednesday with Psalm 23, and Friday with Psalm 35. This builds consistency, spiritual awareness, and a holy habit. Repetition doesn't empty the Psalms, it roots them deeper. Faith is fed not by emotion, but by constancy. God is speaking in every reading, and as you continue, your soul begins to recognize his tone, like a sheep that knows the voice of its shepherd in the noise of life. These psalms also function as a kind of spiritual emergency. Hit during life's crises. When fear presses in, go to Psalm 91. When anxiety about the future rises, lean into Psalm 23. When injustice shakes your peace, cry out with Psalm 35. These are spiritual weapons given by God, crafted to fit every battle. Praying with them aligns your heart with heaven and brings your mind into sync with God's timing. They are divine tools for everyday warfare and peace. This ongoing practice transforms your mindset and strengthens your faith in any circumstance. Over time, you won't just read the Psalms, you'll live them. And even if your problems don't immediately vanish, your posture toward them will radically shift. Prayer becomes less of an escape and more of a strategic spiritual tool. And now that you know how to use each psalm individually, it's time to see how they connect in a complete spiritual journey. Psalms 91, 23, and 35 form a complete spiritual journey, shelter, care, and justice. Each represents a phase in life with God, from days of fear to moments of confrontation and eventual victory. Psalm 91 teaches us to trust in the invisible protection that flows from above. Psalm 23 reminds us that even in silence, God cares for us with detail and tenderness. And Psalm 35 reveals that God fights for us in battles we cannot win alone. battles where only divine justice prevails. These psalms complement one another as if forming parts of a single conversation between heaven and the human heart. The first guards us, the second guides us, and the third defends us. The Bible doesn't promise a life without pain, but it offers us one with constant divine presence. God is speaking through every season, in the refuge, in the pasture, and on the battlefield. The powerful prayers birthed from these psalms give us balance to remain standing when life tries to shake us. Combining these psalms in daily life means living in a state of spiritual awareness. It's knowing when to rest, when to seek shelter, and when to cry out for justice. It's learning to recognize God's signals in every detail and to discern His timing with maturity and peace. Mature faith doesn't run in desperation. It walks with confidence, even in the presence of enemies or in the valley of shadows. This biblical sequence becomes a spiritual map for navigating the soul's seasons with purpose and clarity. Practically speaking, you can create a 3-psalm routine. Start the week with protection. Psalm 91, stay grounded with direction, Psalm 23, and finish with bold cries for justice and answers, Psalm 35. This cycle brings emotional structure, spiritual resilience, and renewed hope. God's miracles manifest when faith is translated into practice, and His voice becomes more audible when His word is lived out with intention, not just admiration or theory. Now that you've discovered the 3 most powerful psalms in the Bible, you can begin a new phase of your spiritual journey, a stage where Scripture is not merely read but applied, where prayer is not just ritual but a living dialogue with heaven. May this message from God today draw you closer to His presence, His guidance, and His justice. Because anyone who lives this spiritual trilogy will realize they were never truly alone. They just needed to learn how to listen. You've made it this far because you have a deep thirst to hear God's voice. And now you know it can be heard clearly through the details of these eternal psalms. But the real question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you keep it to yourself, or will you turn it into daily practice? Psalm 91 taught you that God offers security even in fearful times. Psalm 23 showed you that His care is constant even when He seems silent, and Psalm 35 revealed that even injustices carry divine purpose. Now it's your turn to apply, pray, and live it all out with courage. If God's voice feels distant, start where it's closest, in the Bible. Turn these psalms into personal prayers. Write down verses that speak to your heart and declare them out loud. Create a journal of promises. Pray with your family. Share these words with someone going through a hard time. It's not enough to simply listen. You need to obey and trust. God is speaking to you right now through this message, calling you to step into something new. The spiritual battle you're facing today can be won with the right weapons. And the word is your most powerful one. Now tell me, which of these psalms spoke most deeply to you? Leave a comment below sharing which verse impacted you and how you plan to apply it in your life. And if this message touched your heart, share it with someone who needs divine direction. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss out on messages that will strengthen your faith. Leave a like and help spread this word. May God bless you. There's a new video every day, so come back tomorrow for another fresh portion of God's word for your life.